and I'm excited today to speak to you about my work on energy and what I'm currently doing on social media. I'm Anna. I did my PhD in anthropology, and I actually identify both professionally and personally quite closely as an anthropologist, and I'll get into that, but I think it's more than just a job. It's a way of seeing and understanding and analyzing the world. And so it's an important thing for me to mention. Since I will be talking about social media, I put my social media handles below, so please feel free to reach out to me on any of those platforms. Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and I'll start by explaining that picture because it was taken about 2 weeks ago when I was traveling to Oman. I was actually visiting another PhD friend of mine who is from Oman and who invited me to see his country. And Oman is fascinating to me, having studied the energy industry in Norway, because Oman too is a fossil fuel rich country on the Arabian Peninsula. So I was really excited to see some of these oil installations, but to get there, it was a long flight. It was a very long drive through the desert, hours and hours and hours of just deserted land and desert land. So not very carbon efficient, but I got to see these various oil rigs, oil platforms. And that one you see in the background, you can kind of see the container, and above it is the main installation. And surprisingly, it was just built a couple of days before I went there. So it was very new. It was a Chinese company which built it. It was a couple of huge parts coming together from all over the world, which they assembled on site. And the day I came, they halted production because they lost a pipe in one of the wells, and they were waiting for a huge magnet to try and lift the pipe from the well back out. So they were in the process of drilling and getting things started, which was very interesting to me. And actually, just a bit about, to get the anthropology in here, when I left the car and went onto the site, I thought I would feel vibrations on the ground, and I really got that sense that the ground was vibrating from all the drilling. So I put my hand on the sand, and then the site manager was laughing at me and asked me what I was doing, and I told him, well, I'm feeling the vibrations from your drilling activity. And at that point, I had no idea that they stopped their activities. So he was laughing. He said, yeah, you're just imagining this. And I thought, wow, okay, I went there with this perception that I'm experiencing all this drilling activity, but really I was just imagining it. So it's good to be aware that sometimes our perceptions can trick us. So just very briefly about my own energy and my personal energy and sustainability journey. I knew very early on that I wanted to do something about climate change. It was as a teenager in school, Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth was being streamed in the classroom, and I was very inspired by it, and wanted to devote my life doing something proactive with regards to the climate problem. And so thankfully, I got the chance to do my PhD at the Center for Energy Ethics for the past 5 years, which was an energy, sustainability, and a climate change related PhD project, which I will be telling you about. But during this time, I didn't just learn things professionally, but also for my own life. The people that I spoke to, the people that I interviewed, they challenged some of my assumptions and vice versa. It was a mutual learning experience. So I've grown to question a lot of my own practices and own assumptions, and I'm still learning every day. I think my sort of philosophy when it comes to sustainability is that there's no perfection, and we have to allow for exceptions to make a lasting lifestyle change in our lives that's moving towards more sustainability. So I already mentioned the anthropology bit. You know now that it's important to me, and I'm sure it will come back throughout this presentation. But so what I've been doing over the past couple of months very intensively, but I started it about a year or actually 2 years ago, is that I'm doing content creation on social media. And particularly, I'm trying to spread some of my research findings and lessons that I've learned and my own challenges with regards to energy and sustainability on social media platforms. And the reason behind that is because I think, even though I love the academic research and the rigor that is attached to it, I want to make sure that this information isn't gate kept within an academic community which is already interested in the topic. But my goal is to reach people who might know very little about it, who might not even be very interested in it, in a way that's very accessible to a lay person. And for me, doing this on social media is a great challenge to get my brain to convert my research into something that's, you know, almost fun and exciting and manageable. For today, I will be dividing this presentation in two parts. In the first, I will share with you some information about my research and my research process, and I will present you with three key findings, which I think are relevant for the Energy Cafe today. And then those findings will lead on to social media and the impact that social media had on my research, but also I hope to engage you and ask you about your relationship to it. So get ready for me to ask you some questions, mentally prepare yourself, because I'd love to know how you're using social media, if you're using it, if you're open to it, or if you think, actually, I can't be bothered, it's not my cup of tea. And then we will tackle what might be interesting and what might be in it for you and engaging with it a little bit further. So I'll be sharing three key tips to get started with social media in the second part of this presentation. Okay, to get us started, a bit about my research. Before, actually, I should tell you two things that are necessary to know about Norway, because that's where I conducted my research. And even though it was context and country and case study specific, I think a lot of the observations I found and made are applicable in other countries who are going through energy transitions. But in Norway specifically, Norway is one of the world's largest fossil fuel producers, meaning oil and gas in their case. And especially now with the war in Ukraine, the demand for Norwegian oil has really increased significantly. It's supplying gas to many places in Europe. So it doesn't only have an economic resource role, but also sort of a geopolitical role as a sort of Western ally to many countries supplying fossil fuels. At the same time, Norway produces renewable energy, and actually most of the oil and gas is exported abroad. And in Norway itself, there's use of this renewable energy in things like electric cars, and it's hydropower and wind power. And Norway abroad internationally promotes itself as a climate leader. So there is this kind of conflict, this tension that arises between these different roles. And the people that I work with often refer to it as a Norwegian schizophrenia or the Norwegian paradox, really alluding to this core energy dilemma between promoting both fossil fuels and renewable energy at the same time. So this is just for you to get some context of which country I entered and what kind of industry I was dealing with. And so I was in Norway to do research from September 2018 to February 2020. And I mentioned this time period because I think if I were to do the research again right now, I would probably get quite different results. This time, and I will get to this in a second on the next slide, this time was very much a time of change and transitions, and efforts to become greener and cleaner were very much on the agenda for a lot of the energy companies that I visited. Now, after the pandemic, with the conflict, the war, Russian-Ukrainian war, it's a lot more about oil than it was when I was there. But I'll get to that. So my research was based in two host companies. The first one was a consulting company, and the second one was an energy production company doing both oil and gas as well as renewables. And I didn't investigate the companies. What I was really interested in was the people in leadership and expert positions in these companies. So I had an interest in examining how industry leaders, how those strategically situated, dealt with these questions of climate change, of energy transitions, what kind of expectations they had for the future, whether they felt responsible to do something, whether they felt responsible for creating the problem. And when I, on social media, I get these questions and concerns about leaders, industry leaders a lot. People have a tendency to attribute responsibility to those in these strategic positions. as those who created the problem and as those who are supposed to fix it. So I wanted to know, what do these people themselves think and how do they feel and what are their ethical, economic, and environmental concerns? And I put here the term energy elites because it's one that I use throughout my thesis and throughout my work, and it's also in the title of today's presentation. And I could talk about this for days. I won't bother you with it because I'm assuming you're not as interested in elites as I am. This is a previous research interest of mine. But you might be wondering, why do I refer to those people I worked with as elites? And the reason is, well, actually, elite sort of has a almost negative connotation nowadays in the media. But the way I'm using it is tracing it back to the original use of the term, where it very much noted people who were moving into strategic positions based on merits, based on their own achievements, rather than those people who inherited a position based on their family affiliations. And in Norway, it seemed pretty similar. The people that I met, they identified as hard workers, as self-made business people, and as being in those positions based on their own achievements. And so I was dealing with people who, from experts, mid-level managers, executives, investors, shareholders, that sort of echelon of the industry. And there were commonalities amongst these people, even though they didn't all know each other. They had similar lifestyles, similar economic positions. They owned similar assets, houses, boats, cars, cabins. But at the same time, there were differences, gender differences, differences in nationality, which led to inequalities even within this group and this community of energy professionals. So I talk about that in my thesis, and I sort of tease out what that community of people was like. But again, I won't bore you with the details. I'm happy to speak about it more if you're interested during the Q&A. Okay, so I am presenting to you some key findings now, and they sort of interrelate. So I might be jumping back and forth between the three that you're seeing here. As I already mentioned, one of the key things I noticed during my time in Norway was the mentioning of changes and the importance that people awarded to transitions. There really was this atmosphere, this kind of omnipresent atmosphere of changes in the industry, and particularly so during the later half of my research, so throughout 2019 and the beginning of 2020. And part of that, I think, is because this was also, if you remember, the time of the rise of Greta Thunberg. She was everywhere at that time. She was at the UN, she made the cover of Vogue, she was rallying people, motivating people to protest for the climate. And in Norway too, that really had an effect. Students and adults would go and gather in front of the parliament building to protest on Fridays, sometimes even other days. And increasingly publics in Norway demanded for the industry to phase out or shut down completely the oil and gas production. This didn't go unnoticed by the people in the leading positions. Again, on my social media, I often hear people say that they assume elites, people in power positions, don't really care about climate change. They care about profit. They don't feel responsibility. But I found that they were really faced by these movements on social media and public movements, the demands that were voiced in newspaper articles towards a greener and cleaner future. So engaging with this and changing their marketing, changing their branding, and engaging more and more in these kind of renewable energy, sustainably driven projects, they really engaged with the notion of energy transitions. But even though most people were envisioning a clean, green, good energy future, I think out of those over 100 people I spoke to, most had a different idea of how to get there and what the endpoint would look like. There was not very much agreement. Some people were expecting the endpoint to be a place of being carbon neutral. Some people demanded a future that was carbon zero. Others said oil and gas would be used for centuries to come. And similarly, they didn't agree on the way that energy transitions should be done. So what I found is that these transitions were really very liminal spaces. Now, liminal is a typically anthropological word, basically meaning that it was an uncertain time period of the in-between, where it was sort of a situation where everything still passed and everything goes. So those who were advocating oil and gas activities said, well, we need gas, we need oil to transition, because without it, we can't transition. Others who were working with renewable energy, they said, well, renewable energy is the only way forward. We need this, we need more of it, we need it now. So that's what I mean with liminal. It was a period that was where many trajectories were pursued at the same time. And I think the risk of that is that it might become the end point rather than a means to an end. Because if that is a space where everyone can sort of find a space and feel comfortable, where every kind of energy production can be legitimized, then there is very little incentive to move to a point where it goes in a more sort of carbon neutral direction. So I found that very interesting. And again, this is something we can talk about during the Q&A. The other thing is, I think that this is related, what I've just said is related to the way people were thinking about climate change and the future. For many of the people I worked with, climate change was a matter of the future. It was a far away crisis that was some time happening, but not really now. It felt distant, and they also often argued that in Norway, the country was less affected by climate change than elsewhere in the world. So many felt that they had time, that this thing looming over them was approaching, but maybe not as soon, which led many to think that the present was rich and that most benefit should be extracted from the present. So practically speaking, that meant that many were advocating to get as much oil and gas out of the ground as possible, as soon as possible, until one day maybe it's not possible anymore. So I use the term hamstring because it really was sort of, it felt to me like a bit of hamstring, get it out now while we still can, take the money, put it in an oil fund, which Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, which mostly stems from oil money. And then we use that money when we need it in the future. So there was this distinct sense that the future could be worse than the present. And that very much impacted how people were acting at the moment and how business decisions were made. Now, to lead over to the second part of this presentation, as I already mentioned, I think social media and public voices really had an impact on the industry. And it got people also, not just on the industry and on the companies and on their strategies, but on the individuals, the people who are in this industry. And so what I observed is that reconsidering and having these ethical queries and thinking about the energy dilemma motivated a lot of people to leave their oil jobs and move into the renewable sector. So out of my total amount of interlocutors, about a third chose to leave oil to pursue a job in the renewable or wider sustainability industries. And they did so for various reasons. Some were really like professionally strategic because they were offered a higher salary, but most mentioned that it was at least in part inspired by their desire to do something about climate change and to become more proactive. And that again was picked up by the public and it was put into newspaper articles. And so that again created talking points leading back to the public. So you see what I'm trying to say here. I think there was this communication between publics inspiring elites, if you will, and elites, again, sending out a message that was received by the public. And they were, these articles were saying, wow, okay, so these people in those high positions in the energy industry are turning their backs on oil and gas. What does this mean? So it set some signals in the industry. Okay, so I asked here before I move on, the question that I asked at the very bottom, are energy transitions and climate change an elite matter? We can come back to this, but I think it's an interesting question because, again, to reiterate, I get a lot of comments on my videos saying that it is, I'm just a normal person. I can't do anything. Whatever I'll do has very little impact, but it is those big people that should be leading the way. And I understand it, and I think there's a lot of merit to it, but I also think that one shouldn't underestimate the power of having a strong opinion, sharing it with others, and coming together via mediums like social media to create pressure and to present ideas or suggestions. And so this brings me to social media. I think I already mentioned how I got to it briefly. I started about 2 years ago because I had this desire to share my research beyond the academic realm. I wanted it to be understandable and for publics and for people to be engaged with it. But before I move on, I don't know if this works now, if I can ask you questions and if you can respond to it, but I would love to know from some of you what your relationship to social media is like. And I think just to make it easier to answer this, I think there's sort of two broad categories. There's the passive users. These will be people who create an account because they're interested to see what's going on. They want to watch a couple of videos. They want to see some posts, read some articles, but they don't really want to engage and they don't really want to create something themselves. And then there's the other side of the spectrum, which is people who post and who write. This can be anything from one time per year to, very regularly. And then, of course, there's those people who say, oh, why should I even bother with social media? I'm not interested at all. I don't think it's a good environment. I'm not interested. I think the why bother question then is quite important for you. And I agree. I think I see the concern about things being shallow and not very nuanced. And that's something I'm struggling with because, of course, I have this academic background and I want to treat topics in a fair way that gives them justice. But on the media that I work with, I write posts, and that's how I started. But now I mostly do short form videos, and the ones that tend to do the best are between 10 and 20 seconds. And of course, there's only so much you can put in 10 to 20 seconds worth of information. So what I usually do is I make it very concise, and then I put a longer description in the description box where people can then inform themselves and read on if they need to get more nuance. Often people don't do that, and then you get really interesting comments, very emotional, but that is also interesting. I think for me, the reason why I do it is, as already mentioned, I think you can reach people that you normally wouldn't reach with that information because they might just not have it on their radar. They might not be engaged in these kinds of topics. And I think you can, as a researcher, or even if you're a company, or if you are just a student, you can get a very good sense of what moves people in that very specific time period. Because let's say you actually create a piece of content, you usually get reactions pretty immediately. And some will be quite critical, some will be positive, or you don't get any reactions at all. And then you realize that maybe this topic doesn't resonate with people and maybe you have to reword it or repackage it. So I think particularly for researchers, it's quite interesting because you get almost an immediate feedback on the stuff you're working on. And you see, is it timely enough? Is it current enough? How can I rephrase my questions and my thinking to make sure I capture the zeitgeist of this time period? And an example is that in a lot of countries in Europe, after Christmas and around New Year's, it was very, very warm, unusually warm. I live in Liechtenstein, and the temperature normally is around 0 degrees Celsius in winter, but it was 21 degrees Celsius during New Year's, which is usually something we get in spring or summer. And so because this was happening all throughout Europe and even in some parts of the United States and other places, people really, they were curious. They noticed it. They went outside and they felt really shocked by this kind of extreme weather occurrence. And so the social media platforms were filled with people voicing their concerns, and they were really interested in engaging what the possible reasons might be. And so during this time span, climate change discussions were rising again. And they hadn't for a while. And I mentioned Greta Thunberg before, but she sort of peaked, right? And now you don't really hear that much about her anymore, which might be because people have other concerns now. There's the war, there's inflation, there's increasing energy prices. So it was interesting to me as an outside observer that during this time period, climate change was really a topic that people were wanting to learn more about again. So this is just my thoughts on why I think it's worth it to engage with it. But I'm going to, even though I might be in front of a room of passive users, I'm going to give you some tips of how to use it if you do choose to use it actively. Even if you're a passive user, you might use platforms like LinkedIn, or you might use Facebook on occasion. But especially for LinkedIn, I think it's a good thing to post something, even if it's just once or twice a year, to make sure that you're getting noticed and you're staying, you have an opinion on something. There's some event to share. I think it makes sense. So let's assume for a second that you're not just totally passive, but maybe you're interested in the post here and there. I think one thing I'm noticing is that people tend to be have a tendency often to be very long-winded in their explanations. So I put here be intriguing, which sounds sort of fluffy, but it's important because what you want to sort of capture people's hearts and minds, and you do that by telling a story, by giving them something to grab their attention in the beginning, to hook them, to want to know more about what it is you're talking about. And then you don't just want to disappoint them by being boring in the second half of what you're posting or what you make a video about, but you want to provide them with some sort of value. And actually, over the last couple of years, social media platforms have sort of morphed in that before or previously, they really cared about pretty sort of perfectionist content. It was the time where Instagram was really popular, where people would post pictures of their dogs and their perfect brunches and breakfasts, and face tuned their pictures. And that time, I think it shows by Instagram being less and less popular, that time really has passed. I think now social media platforms encourage people to be relatable and to be more personal, and not just to talk about the good times, but to also share challenges, which I'll get to in just a second. But so back to the storytelling, I think it's important to capture people's interest, and one of the best ways to do it is to be slightly provocative in your first couple of words, your first couple of sentences. But then you want to hit them with something that is actually useful to them, something informative, something that is educational. It can be something funny, but it should still provide some sort of value and not leave them hanging with just having looked at a puppy that looks cute. It doesn't do that well anymore. So the next point is to be relatable. And as I mentioned, it makes sense to be personal, to share personal stories. Especially on LinkedIn, for example, those posts tend to do the best, where people speak about, I have a friend, for example, she posted about undergoing depression and how she got herself out of it, and how she used that as a motivator, that difficult time period, to do what she's doing now. And that post, I think, went viral. And it's because people can relate to it. Everyone goes through bad times, not exactly the same things, but people can relate to not having a good time period, and then trying to get out of that, and how they do that is very motivational. And it's real. It's not something, it's not presenting just that picture perfect life, which I think people are tired of. I also wrote here timeliness, and I think this relates to what I mentioned previously, that social media is a pretty good indicator of what people care about at a specific time and place. So when you post, I think it's great to engage with current topics, to engage with things that people have questions about, they don't know an answer to. There's lots of sort of gaps there that can be filled by you as an expert, or as someone who has thoughts on the topic. And then, of course, you can be honest about it. You can say, listen, I'm not an expert on this, but I have this and this opinion. Can someone who knows more about it help me? So it's, after all, it's social media, so it should be like a social interaction, which also brings me to another point, which is that ideally you speak to people in a first person voice, not a narrative voice where you sort of take yourself out of the equation. And often it helps to approach people like a friend. You imagine the kind of person you want to reach, and you speak to them as if you're speaking to them directly. And those posts also do really well, because me as a reader or a viewer, I feel like you're actually intending for me to see this. The other thing to bear in mind is that people have very short attention spans. So it's really the first couple of words in a post or the first couple of seconds in a video. They are sort of the make and break point. If you get people's interest peaked at that point, they will watch on. But if you're taking it too slow, they'll swipe or they will click the next thing because there's always more. So it really helps to be concise, to have short sentences, and to use easy language. And I think in the beginning, I used to underestimate people and really dumb down the language, which was silly because people have a rich language capability. But when I say lay language, I mean, don't use expert terms that only your field will know, or jargon that's really difficult for others and maybe non-native speakers to understand. Also, of course, it has to be mentioned that every social media platform is different. LinkedIn, TikTok, your own website, your company's website, your Facebook, your Instagram, they will be very different in terms of the content that you should be producing on it. And that is dependent on who you're wanting to reach, what kind of audiences you have. And that is a demographic question as well. Is it young people? Is it pensioners? Is it people in a certain business? Is it people with a certain research interest? Is it students that you want to attract to your institution? So that very much depends on what your goal is. And I think that's important to keep in mind. If you just think, okay, I'm just going to write something or post something to whomever is interested, and then I'll see who's interested, doesn't usually work that well, because then it's so broad that you're not most people aren't interested in everything. They have areas of interest. So you want to target those that click with what you are an expert in or what you want to talk about. There's even though there's differences across these platforms, there's some commonalities. As I mentioned, people have short attention spans because there's a lot of offers, a lot to see. There's lots of scrolling. I think for those of you who say you're a passive user, you will probably have noticed this with yourself, that you just scroll and scroll and then, ooh, 30 minutes have passed. But you're actually not devoting a lot of time to the individual people, because after some seconds, you decide this is interesting for me or no, thank you. So as if you are an active user, you want to make sure, again, that you grab attention fairly quickly. And then the other things that people tend to be sort of lazy click-wise. So if you're wanting to advocate, for example, an event or a specific link, you have to make sure that it doesn't take many steps to get to that link from where you initially attract them from. They usually say it's 3 clicks, about 3 clicks, and then people give up. So if you have to click 8 times to get to the link that gets you to sign up, people usually don't stay around. So just to summarize, I think there's different platforms will have, I would give you different advice for how to use it. And for different goals of what you want to do with social media, whether you want to use it as a means to gain some research, to make societal observations, to see how the political atmosphere is like, or whether you want to put information out there, that will very much decide what your strategy on social media is. And with that, I shall stop talking. Thank you very much for listening. You can contact me anywhere here on these platforms, and I'm happy to give you advice. I'm happy to do a workshop, whatever you'd like. Don't be confused by the 2 different names. Both of those are me. So you can write to me an email and I'll get it, or you can find me on LinkedIn with that name and I will get it. Thank you very much.